Okay, this is a lecture for my microorganisms and their human hosts class. And this lecture discusses clinically significant eukaryotic organisms, multicellular parasites that we call helminths. And helminths are parasitic worms. So to get us started, I have an introductory video for you to watch. And so if you would just click on the video, and it's on YouTube, and a short video about 4 to 5 minutes. Watch that video, then come back to this set and meet me again on the second slide. Okay, so we're going to be talking about helminths, which are worms, parasitic worms. And there are three major types. There are the nematodes, cestodes, and trematodes. And I'm going to give you at least one example of each of these groups. Now, as far as worm infections go, mainly they will cause malnutrition, bleeding, abdominal pain. Quite nice. Not really, no. So now, why do we talk about these as far as microbiology goes? Because it's a worm, and lots of times that we can see these with our naked eye. And the thing is, just like with the protozoa, they have a life cycle. And the life cycle of worms is different than the protozoa. However, they're gonna go between different forms, different body shapes and body forms throughout this life cycle. And many of those forms are microscopic. So that's why this is included in with your microbiology. And with these worms, think about that life cycle as well. So within a certain stage, or a cyst stage, is usually how we are infected with these worms. Now, we're going to first start with the nematodes. So one group in the nematodes are the hookworms. So hookworms, I'm going to give you two examples, two species of hookworms, and that is Ankylostoma duodenale and Necator americanus. These are two species of hookworms that are pretty common for hookworm infections. They live in the soil. So these types of worms mainly live in the soil. And what happens is they have the ability to burrow through human skin. And a lot of times it's through the feet. What will happen is that they will start to multiply in our digestive tract. They will make their way to the digestive tract, multiply there, and then it will be excreted in the feces. So not only can these be fecal oral, right, because it's excreted in the feces, but in its normal reservoir of the soil, we can be infect us in that manner as well. So hookworms, why are they called hookworms? You'll notice that picture way over there on the left. You see the portion of the worm with those, it looks like kind of shark teeth. That's the hooks. That's what they're going to use in order to actually use those in order to grasp onto the epithelial lining in our digestive tract. And as the worm grows, it releases these eggs, and it's the eggs that are found in the feces, and that's how it's transmitted around. So we can ingest those eggs and infect ourselves. And then the worm itself can actually burrow through the human skin and get into the body that way. All right, another type of nematode is called Trichinella spiralis, which causes trichonelliosis. There are a few different species of Trichinella. This is just one of the species, the most common, that causes trichonelliosis in humans. So Trichinella spiralis. And it is the cyst stage of the worm that is eaten with food and typically transmitted with undercooked pork. Now, what I first want you to look at is the histio slides, the two histio slides above me. The very top one shows an encysted worm. Okay, the other one, you see the little arrows where it's pointing to some Trichinella larvae in the muscle. And so they're both showing about the same thing, and it's showing it in muscle tissue. So if we look down, so right next to me is it shows a little bit of that life cycle or how that transmission follows. And I say that it finishes up its life cycle in the human. So what happens? How is this transmitted? And you'll notice that I said it is in the pig. This one is typical for the pig. So let's say that we're eating some pork that, and this pig happened to be infected with Trichinella spiralis. What happened is that we're going to find these cysts, like you see at the histio slides, within the meat, and that's the muscle. So the part of the animal that we usually eat is the meat, and we call the meat, which is the muscle, right? And if it's undercooked, that larval stage of the Trichinella spiralis is still viable. That means when we eat it, the digestive juices aren't really going to kill that larval stage, and it can actually start to grow and multiply in us. Now, how do we know if the pig is infected with the Trichinella spiralis? We really don't. Probably a lot have it unless they're being treated for it. However, how do we kill it? How do we prevent that transmission? Is by cooking it, by killing the larva by the heat and killing it, so that when we eat it, we're not infected with it. So any type of undercooked pork not only sets us up for possible infection from this type of worm, but could be other types of worms as well. So it's always good to cook that pork very well and other types of meat very well. Okay, so let's say that we have eaten some undercooked pork on accident and it happened to be infected with the Trichinella, and we have infected ourselves with the Trichinella. It's going to finish up its life cycle in our digestive tract, and it's going to be multiplying there in our digestive tract. And then part of the cysts are going to get into our muscle, right? It's going to get into our muscle and insist there, kind of a resting, a dormant stage in our muscles. That can in turn cause muscle pain for us, and lots of gastrointestinal issues. Now, I said it's still multiplying within our digestive tract. It attaches to the small intestine, so it can lead to this malabsorption, diarrhea, pain, and then the oocyte, the cysts are released in the feces. So we're releasing particles into the feces, which could then infect others as well. Okay, a third type of nematode that we're going to discuss is one that causes pinworms. So these pinworms, and the species is called Enterobius vermicularis, and it causes enterobiasis. So enterobiasis is, I guess, the correct name for a pinworm infection. Now, how is this usually transmitted? It's usually transmitted fecal oral. And these eggs are being picked up from the feces or even touching the anus. They're released from the anus, and then it can contaminate others. When you touch surfaces, it leaves them on the surface. Now, just like the other worms, this has a certain life cycle. We're picking up those eggs, and that's usually how we are infected with them. For pinworms are pretty prevalent in daycare centers. I think there was a study, one study that I read where they did some swabbing at daycare centers and on different surfaces and windowsills and in the bathroom and things like that, changing stations. And there was a large percentage. It was overwhelming how many pinworm eggs were actually found on different surfaces. So it's pretty prevalent in daycares. Now pinworms seem to, the adult stage of the pinworms their adult stage, those worms are much smaller than other types of nematodes. So they're physically much smaller. And what happens is that these worms become more active at night, and we become more aware of them at night. So if lots of children going to daycares are infected with these pinworms, what happens is these worms will kind of wiggle their way out of the anus at night and start getting really itchy. So the anus starts getting really itchy. The kids start scratching at them. The worms and the eggs get underneath their fingernails and get transferred around in that manner, or on their hands. And it's very easy to transmit between one person to another because of that. I have this tape test. So if you've ever heard of the tape test, so if you're ever wondering if your baby or your child or other individual has pinworms, kind of the standard for checking for these pinworms is what's called a tape test. And you would usually do this at night because they are more active at night, is that you would take some Scotch tape, some clear Scotch tape, and what you would do is you would put that over the anus. So completely cover the anus, rip it off, and then put that onto a microscope slide. Put it onto a microscope slide, take a look at the slide, and look to see if you see any particular worms or any worm eggs. Okay, so that's the easiest way to do that, and that's called the tape test. So that you can do a diagnosis in that manner, or take a fecal sample as well. So what is one easy way to reduce the transmission of pinworms is by washing hands. So lots and lots of hand washing to reduce that transmission of these pinworms. Now on to our second group of helminths, and those are cestodes. Cestodes as a whole have a different kind of body setup than do the nematodes. So cestodes have a segmented body. The worms have a segmented body, and the segments have names. So those particular segments are called proglottids. Now, if you look at the very top picture up there, it shows a type of cestode, and as you see a very long segmented body, and then you actually see those proglottids kind of coming off of one end. And that is what happens. These proglottids, these segments are able to come off. As these worms grow, they grow in these segments, and these segments are able to come off of one end. So one type of cestode is called a tapeworm, and I know you've heard of tapeworms. And one species of tapeworms I'm going to give you is called Tinea saginata, and that is the beef tapeworm. So these can grow up to about 1 meter long, and that's pretty long. Adults will attach to the intestines and grow. If you look at the second picture down, that's a picture of one part of this worm, and that part at the very top that looks like that little corona at the top, those are basically hooks. These are hooks that are used in order to grab hold of the inside of the intestine, those cells, and then along the edges are suction cups. So they have a two-prong way in order to hold on, to have this amazing grip on the epithelial cells of our intestines. So what will happen is that how we usually transmit this type of organism is that we are ingesting the eggs or the encysted portion of this worm. Eggs can be ingested, and that's basically fecal oral. So where we have to kind of jump into this life cycle is an infected individual. So an infected individual, let's say if you look at the very top picture, that real skinny part is actually what I would refer to as the head portion. That's where you're going to find the second picture down. And then at the very end is where those proglottids are coming off. So that very skinny end has the part where that's going to be basically embedded into the walls of the intestines. That worm will grow. We provide it with a constant buffet with the material that's moving through our intestines, and so it's able to metabolize and grow and become longer and longer. Those proglottids, those pieces that are kind of breaking off from the end, those proglottids can break off, and we can find those in the feces. They will find in the feces. They can also merge into new worms. So these proglottids that are found in the feces can actually grow into a whole new worm if it's ingested into another person or into the same individual. Okay, so people can ingest those eggs. Now, people can also eat animals that are infected with these tapeworms. What a tapeworm does also, even though it's living in our intestines, one part of the life stage can actually encyst into our muscles. That sounds familiar. That's what we just talked about before with the other type of worm. So there are different types of tapeworms depending on the organism. You can have fish tapeworms, pork tapeworms, and even beef tapeworms. And if you ingest them, they're going to do about the same thing as they do in their normal host. Now they're just in the human host. So they're going to live within the intestines, and then they can also encyst within our muscles. Now this picture directly above me, I believe that is just a piece of meat, beef in the muscle, and you can actually see where the little arrows are pointing to. These are encysted worms, encysted tapeworms. So if we were to eat that meat, if the meat wasn't all the way cooked enough to cook the tapeworm and kill it, then we could infect ourselves with that tapeworm. What's going to happen? It's going to finish up its life cycle, and it will grow and make its way into the alimentary canal and attach into our alimentary canal there in our digestive system. And then it will also encyst in our muscles as well. Now that's all well and good. We have muscle pain, not good, you know what I mean. So we can have muscle pain. We can have lots of cramping and diarrhea. As these worms start to grow and live within our intestines, sometimes they grow so long that they come out of the anus, and they're still attached, right? So you try to pull on them, you're pulling off part of the worm, but most of the worm is actually inside the intestines and already attached. You cannot physically pull it out to pull that entire worm out. If you pull too hard, you're just pulling parts of that worm off. So there's different types of tapeworms for the different organisms. I'll give you an example of Taenia solium. Taenia solium is the pork tapeworm, and that particular species invades the human host in this manner, but can also go to the brain. So this is the problem when some of these tapeworms have the ability to cross that blood-brain barrier and make its way into the brain. And that's what it does in the brain, is encysts itself into the brain. And when it does that, it can destroy the brain tissue, and that can lead to death as well. Now, why do I have these pictures right over here on the bottom left? Is because way back when they figured out if you were infected with a tapeworm, you could eat a lot of food and not gain a whole lot of weight. Well, that's because the tapeworm is causing some malabsorption. We're feeding the tapeworm, and it's causing a lack of absorption into our body, into our blood and lymph, and therefore our body, and causing people to lose weight. And you know how fad diets are. What became possible at the turn of not our last century, but the century before that, is, and a little bit earlier than that as well, is to take parts of that tapeworm eggs, and to ingest them into our bodies, so that tapeworm sets up house in our intestine and prevents that absorption into our blood and prevents us from gaining weight. So it's not the best method. However, you know, do you want a worm growing out of your butt, or do you want to, you know, maintain a healthy lifestyle? So we don't do that anymore, hopefully. But that was a thing, and there's a little advertisement for when they were selling these like encapsulated pills that would infect you with a tapeworm. Pretty wild. Let's never do that. Okay, on to our last group of helminths, and those are the trematodes. So trematodes have have a body style that's different than the other two, and this body style is more leaf-like. So they're more flat and they look like a leaf. If you look at that very top picture up there, someone with a gloved hand holding on to a trematode, it looks like a leaf, right? But it's not. It's one of these worms. Now, we commonly refer to these as flukes. So these are flukes. These are types of worms, and there are different types of flukes. There's liver, intestinal, lung, and blood flukes. So human infections are most common in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and also in the Middle East. Not so much in the United States, but it has been known to occur. And there is one particular species I'm going to give you, and that is Schistosoma mansoni. So Schistosoma mansoni, and that is an example of a blood fluke that causes schistosomiasis. So these are flat leaf-like bodies, and in the life cycle of these particular worms, I like this picture over here off to the left, and how it is released into the environment is usually within the feces, in this case also urine. So eggs of these worms can be released in the feces or the urine. And what's interesting about this one is that snails are an intermediate host. So the worm eggs hatch and go into snails. And then snail is the intermediate host, and the worm will develop to a certain stage within the snail, and it needs the snail in order to do that. Then the young worms will leave the snail and go into another person. How does it do that? It can do that through water transmission. It can do that through somebody swimming in infected water, okay? And it can also be from water transmission and indirect transmission as well. So what happens? Now I said that there's liver, intestinal, lung, and blood flukes. And that's basically tells you which area of the body where we're going to find this particular worm attaching to. So if it's a liver fluke, it's going to attach to the liver, attach to the liver. If it's intestinal, it attaches to the inside of the intestines. If it's in the lung, it attaches to the lungs, right? So you get the idea. If it's blood, it's the inside of a blood vessel. And usually these flukes, this type of trematode, causes a little bit more severe infection and can lead to death if not treated. All right, so that ends our lecture here on helminths. Of course, this in no way covers all of parasitic worms, but it kind of gives you a little sprinkling of each type of parasitic worms so that you can learn a little bit more about each of those.